Welcome to The Enriched Nurse with your host, Dan Richmond. Enrich your personal finances, nursing career, and life.
Today's episode, I'm going to discuss supply and demand, which is an economic concept that I think is often overlooked and can be very useful to making better financial decisions. It influences everything around us, and you really ignore it at your own financial detriment. Over the years, paying attention to economics and what's going on around me has helped me make better financial decisions, and I think it might help you make them as well. Just FYI, today's episode does have a handful of unbeeped curse words. As always, we would love it if you would leave a review for our show and podcast, share it with your fellow nurses, subscribe, follow, or like us on social media. Be sure to check the show notes for a bunch of valuable links on how you can take advantage of our education and free resources, and subscribe. We are the only ANCC-approved provider of nursing continuing professional development that is focused on nurse financial health. Use your employer funds and paid hours to actually get paid to achieve nurse financial freedom and financial literacy with our accredited nursing continuing education. You've got a shit lot. I didn't anticipate a neighbor I've never met telling that to my wife about the property I had bought at age 18 in Shelter Cove, California, just minutes after we stepped out of our vehicle. Is it really that shitty? I mean, it's on a cul-de-sac, it's got a view of the ocean, and it is bordered by a greenway. We took the kids on an epic road trip this summer from Southern Oregon down Highway 101 to Shelter Cove, over to San Francisco, over to Yosemite, went to Tahoe, checked out Lassen on our return. And, sometimes I wonder about my judgment doing a huge road trip, but honestly, we had a really good time. Our kids hadn't seen that property yet, and my wife and I probably hadn't been there in 10 years, so I figured, we should make sure that there's no squatters living on that property, and Shelter Cove is a pretty cool place. But between a book that I'm reading and revisiting this relic from my past, it really reminded me the importance of the concept of supply and demand. And at one point, this lot had more than quadrupled in value. I felt really smart for having bought it. And my buddy actually sold his for a $73,000 profit. I actually held on to my lot, and it's now probably worth the same, probably even less than, especially in inflation-adjusted dollars, than what I paid for it 23 years ago. And I still pay California taxes on it, and I have been for years. Unfortunately, demand for real estate in Shelter Cove appears at a historical low, and the supply of cheap lots is very high, and that is to my financial disadvantage. So let's discuss supply, demand, broke millennials, and nurses in general today. And in recognition of Labor Day, I have some historical facts I think you will find pretty interesting that kind of ties into my thinking around this. So understanding supply and demand is really important to wise money management. This book title caught my eye recently on Hoopla. If you don't know what Hoopla is, it's a free digital library app that you can get access to movies, books, audio, music, and more, like on your mobile device, and it's free. It's with your library card. It's a good way to save a few bucks. You could cancel a subscription, just use Hoopla for a bit. The book that caught my eye was Young, Broke, and Educated, which is a book, about the financial plight of millennials. And since I'm a millennial who isn't young or broke, it did catch my eye. I am educated, at least. So the main book I'm reading is for entertainment. It's, book 7 in the Wheel of Time series, which is a great series. I'm more quickly scanning this one. I read it while I'm working out, and I don't really want to bash the book, but from what I've read so far, it's a long list of all the reasons why millennials can't get ahead and other generations had more advantages, and I'm about halfway through it. And one thing I've noticed in the age of information is how, despite infinite access to all the information you could possibly want or have, right? A lot of us don't seem to know very much, myself included. The book, it has a long list of grievances and opinions for why millennials are so broke, including the minimum wage, the 30-year mortgage, immigrants, and, it even goes so far as to claim millennials are the first generation to be worse off than their parents. And, some of it I think defies some common sense and some basic historical facts. And like I said, I haven't read the whole thing. There's a clear political bias in this book. But like I said, it blames a lot of people. And I think it leaves out one particular group to blame, and I think that's millennials themselves, and not just us, but everybody. because some of these things, some of these issues that are cited really tie back to supply and demand. When I read our generation is better than yours, or your generation has had more opportunities, or kids these days type stuff, I really harken back to history class. And I want to go over some key historical facts from the last 100 years or so that I think can help with that, especially since it was Labor Day yesterday. And my Grammy had her birthday this summer. She's 101, and she's still alive. And I think that helps put it in perspective. And she's very sweet, my Grammy. And I want to use her as an anchor for some of these historical facts. And don't get me wrong, when I say blame millennials, I mean, in this day and the age of information, it's not just millennials, it's everybody. It is so easy to be distracted, get in an echo chamber, and not think as critically about things as we could. And so I want to put this idea that we're all just worse off and things are hopeless financially, like millennials are broke and have no prospects. And it's because, namely, housing and education's too expensive. Let's go back 100 years or so and really take a historical perspective and see, are things really that bad? So slavery, it ended in 1865. So my Grammy was born in 1923, and someone born in 1865 when slavery ended would have been about 58. So how many formerly enslaved or those born into slavery were still alive when my Grammy was born, do you think? I mean, probably a lot. The last known former slave died in 1971, and that was 13 years before I was born. I mean, that's kind of crazy. So this idea that other people had it better than us, somebody was born into slavery pretty close to my lifetime, and definitely during my Grammy's lifetime. I mean, come on. I don't think things are that bad in 2025. So women gained the national right to vote in 1920, 3 years before Grammy was born. So most adult women hadn't had the right to vote for very long when she was born. Social Security, it was established in 1935. It was first available at age 60. The average life expectancy back then was about 61.7 years, and that was for all races and genders. And for black men, just 51 years. That was the life expectancy. So the idea of retirement, it hadn't even been around that long, maybe around 1885. Definitely not as this mainstream decades-long experience that I think a lot of people are expecting these days. So many were quite literally working until they died. Happy day after Labor Day. So as I'm recording this, it's just Labor Day 2025, and the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed in 1938, which established minimum wage, banned child labor, among a lot of other things. But think about that. Child labor in the U.S. existed less than 90 years ago. I mean, that's crazy. My Grammy could have been subject to it. We could go on and on with these historical facts, but the point I'm making is a lot of transformation has occurred just in the last 100 years, from basic rights to economic assurances within our society. I'm not even talking about wars, flu pandemics, civil rights movements. So, I mean, let's forget which generation has had it better, because I think a lot of generations have had it exponentially better since my Grammys. And I think that kind of ties back to supply and demand. And here's why. Because all these changes really transformed the quality of life and the way of living in general for the masses. It has led to more competition for living a better life because we all have the potential to be more prosperous. And the economy has grown, and we are impacted by supply and demand. When I see these things in the past, we don't have the same opportunities they have. That might be true for very specific groups of people. But I think now, across the board, more people have better opportunities than in the past. But I think people forget how bloody and violent U.S. history has been, and how many groups of people did not have it better than what we have now. And that's not to say that there's not still issues and there's not still poverty, but when you really look at the historical facts, I mean, the potential for a better life, I think, is higher now. And, and this is probably a controversial statement, but I think based on the historical facts I just pointed out and am familiar with based on my history knowledge, I think it's hard to argue against that. The way supply and demand works is each impacts the other, influencing markets and people's economic decisions. So when people want something that has limited supply, prices go up. When there's too much supply and people aren't demanding it as much, prices go down, or at least the amount of supply will be reduced. like more closely match the need. If a supplier isn't meeting demand, other competitors and suppliers, they might actually increase the supply. Marketing can create demand. Also, unforeseen disasters can decrease supply or create demand. Think of toilet paper during COVID. There's a long list of other ways that supply and demand can be manipulated, and I'll provide several examples here shortly, including what you can do about it to make better financial decisions. It seems to me there's a lot more demand for everything in general because there's a lot more prosperity to go around, release money available. American household debt is at an all-time high of $18 trillion, with over $1 trillion of that on credit cards alone. There's a lot more money out there and available to more people, and they tend to take on debt and they tend to spend it. So back to the book I was reading. So a lot of the big issues cited in the book about sinking millennials' prospects are education and housing. And there's no question that housing and education have gotten a lot more expensive, even than when I graduated high school. Good paying jobs, easy money, they're not widespread either. And as I record this, layoffs are once again occurring in healthcare. Reimbursements for healthcare are expected to go way down. That's going to affect healthcare employers. So demand for education was probably at an all-time high for millennials. I didn't research that. I just know when I was becoming an adult, the push was you got to get a degree, and it seemed like that just kind of took off. And as basic economics would demand, as you have more people trying to get a degree, the cost of tuition is going to go up. And as far as I can tell, universities just operate like businesses, right? They increase their prices accordingly. And just because you're getting a degree doesn't mean you're going to have good earnings from that degree. So it really kind of depends on the value of that education. Is going to be dependent on the kind of earnings you can get from the degree or the career that you can take from it. So, let's consider like an MBA, so a Master's of Business Administration. There's a lot of people, smart people with MBAs. There's a ton of supply of smart people with MBAs, and it can probably feel like, especially when the economy is not doing well, that it's ridiculous that you have an MBA and you're getting coffee for older generations or working as their assistant, and you feel like you can't get ahead or make money with that degree. On the flip side of that, there's all kinds of other degrees, right? On the flip side of that, an associate's nursing degree is probably going to net you higher earnings than, say, like getting a bachelor's of psychology. I myself, when I graduated high school, I was thinking, I'll probably go into business. I was going to go down that MBA path probably. I was thinking a bachelor's of business administration or, decided what I wanted to do. And a friend convinced me, like, you should go into nursing. And that was a much better decision because depending on the degree, you might do really well income-wise or not so much. So we'll get back to that here in a bit. But demand for housing, the other one. It is pretty insane. So most seem convinced that renting is throwing money away, and rent prices are high too, especially in popular places to live, places in high demand. And it's kind of crazy to me how willing people are to take on a mortgage and buy a house with hardly any money down. Even these days, with interest rates being higher than they'd been for a long time, it hasn't had the impact on home prices that you would expect. They're still kind of sticky. And the supply of homes for sale is still relatively low, and homes are still being bought. There's still a demand there. So the author of that book, Young, Broke, and Educated, it sounded like he grew up in the Bay Area, which is going to skew your perspective, I think. The Bay Area is it's expensive. And I'll talk a little bit more about my thoughts on rent and housing in the Bay Area and how that impacted me personally here shortly. But I had a great uncle. I used to go visit him in the 90s. He had like a really nice house in San Francisco overlooking, you could see the Golden Gate Bridge from it. It was pretty cool. Bay View and stuff. He sold that place for like $300,000 and moved up to Oregon back then. Something like that now would be well over like $3 million in the Bay Area. Houses without a view are going for millions of dollars there. That's pretty insane. But the demand for homes in the Bay Area is also really, really insane. I have friends in my neighborhood, who literally sold their homes in expensive California cities, and then they move up to Oregon and they've bought like 2 houses. They got one they live in, one they rent out. So, that's good for them. It kind of sucks for us, especially if you're, wanting to buy a house and not wanting to compete with other people who have, more money to burn on not just one, but maybe 2. And I don't blame them. I blame supply and demand, because they would only be able to sell a standard home in like Napa, California, if people were willing to pay the premium to live there. And now they're driving lower supply and increased demand for housing in my area. And they probably aren't haggling on the prices too much either. Because, when you sell a house for like $1 million, down south in California, and then you can buy a house up here for like $400,000 or so. I mean, it probably feels like a real bargain. But it's not just California either. I mean, with the internet, the ease of information and more, like there's all kinds of people looking to exploit cheap real estate prices outside their geographic areas, snap up deals on real estate and cheaper locales, which decreases the supply, increases demand. So don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. Like, it is tough. There's a lot of factors there that are leading to these things. But I don't think it's as simple as like, oh, things were just better in the past, and our parents' generation or these older generations are greedy and screwing us over. It is so much more complicated than that. And don't get me wrong, I complain, I get annoyed about economic forces like supply and demand all the time. The timing can often be annoying. For example, my wife and I got a couple little kids that are getting older, and we want to start saving for a second home, but like she's literally not getting any hours at work. There's a high supply of nurses on her unit. There is a low demand, fewer patients. We haven't seen census levels like this in years. Hasn't gotten like a shift in months, and that's coming off of like a 2-month strike that we were on earlier this year. And so we're not really getting like a good start on our down payment, and we don't have like a bunch of excess cash flow like we normally have each month. So I'm anticipating needing like $150,000 to put down on potentially different, bigger house. And I don't want to sell our current home because, one, I want to live here again, but two, it will cash flow really well as a rental. So, sure, we could sell our house, use the equity, and it wouldn't be a huge deal, but that's not really in line with what our goals are. And like, honestly, it's not like we have to sell our house. We actually really like it. Right now, we got our kids bunking up together. If things don't pan out, we don't get to do what we'd like to do. The result will be we'll give up our kind of family music dance studio room so our kids don't have to bunk up as teenagers. And I mean, that's hardly that big of a sacrifice. We're still in a 3-bedroom house. But, therein seems the biggest issue in our economy right now, especially since COVID. There is this appetite and demand that is driving up a lot of prices for a lot of things. And it can't seem to be satisfied. And it didn't help that so much money was pumped into the economy during and after COVID. And so far as I can tell, like, many people are just willing to pay or borrow, really, whatever it takes, not just to eat out like restaurants, buy homes and college degrees, but like practically anything, like whatever they feel like they need at the time. I mean, every patio in my neighborhood is just like a constant supply of products showing up every single day, from who knows what on Amazon to like full on meal kits and stuff, and like getting things delivered. It's kind of crazy how much the standard of living has changed. I see tons of housekeepers stopping by cleaning people's houses too, and we're not talking about mansions. So the standard of living is quite a bit higher that I've noticed. And this means higher prices for everything, all these things, like even housekeepers. I've heard nurses complaining how expensive a housekeeper is. And other areas are seeing large price hikes too, like transportation, energy costs, and insurance. Like my homeowner's insurance jacked up like over $400 this year. It's pretty lame. I remember I wanted to upgrade my mountain bike during COVID. So let's just talk about some basic products. So, I mean, everybody started buying outdoor stuff like mountain bikes, travel trailers, kayaks, SUPs. All those things would have cost you a ton. There was insane demand. There were shortages of these things, and people, even for used stuff, could charge really high prices. And so I was just like, well, I guess I'm not in the market for a mountain bike after all. I wasn't going to pay like a ton of money for it. And I didn't need it. My current mountain bike was good enough. So I waited. Demand went down. I got a really good deal on a really fancy mountain bike. Would have cost like several $1,000s new that I got, for like a fraction of that. And I noticed some friends recently were out at the lake, and they had this really sweet, really expensive looking kayak car rack with like a lift assist and some really fancy kayaks it all looked brand new. And they saved thousands of dollars buying this thing used during a period now where there's not like a ton of demand. And the people who bought it sound like they had bought it at peak demand and paid like thousands of dollars for it a few years back and then didn't really continue using it. So now things seem to have a higher supply and a much better price point, things like that. Meanwhile, like restaurants, God, do you remember during COVID? It was crazy. Like huge waits for tables and takeout, and prices started going up, and people were willing to pay for them, wanted to support the restaurant industry, or also just wanted some kind of luxury, I suppose, and all kinds of other reasons. But with inflation and everything, those prices have stuck around, and people are still willing to pay really high restaurant prices. It's really expensive to go eat at restaurants now, especially if you have growing kids. You got to buy twice as many meals. So, and now housing. Let's get back to housing, because I know that one's frustrating. It's a huge chunk of people's income. And somehow my parents, like in the 80s, they managed to buy multiple houses with like the help of my grandparents and, despite being lower middle class. And they got these unfathomable deals in areas where demand was low. And these days, the demand, the Portland area was like incredibly high now. But I didn't have that kind of ability like when I was a young adult. But a lot has also changed. So I recently saw this Reddit post. It's basically this person complaining about their parent recommending they moved to Alabama. But essentially, they're blaming like all their current housing woes and all the reasons why they can't get ahead. But one thing that really stuck out to me is they're living in New York City, and they were talking like there's no other option. Like the only option they have is to live in one of the most expensive, most competitive, most highest demand places for like not just real estate and housing, but probably jobs, food, like everything, right? It's an expensive place to live. I get it. Being told, oh, just move from New York City to like Alabama, that probably is going to seem like an extreme suggestion. But it seems absurd. But like the idea that there's nowhere else to live but New York City, that's pretty absurd too. And again, it comes down to common sense, supply and demand. If there's way too many people wanting to live in a place and willing to pay whatever, and prices are crazy expensive. Even nurses, I don't think, make great money in New York. You shouldn't be surprised that that's like the trade-off, right? You may not be able to control your ability to buy certain things. You do have the ability to control how you're contributing the demand for it and maybe living in other places. It's tough and it's not fair. Like if you grew up and lived there in a place, you shouldn't be getting priced out. I get that. It sucks. But it's not like this is a new problem around the world, right? I want to break down several more examples of supply and demand in action and get you just kind of thinking about these things and how it can cost you, how you can save money if you aren't careful, and how I tend to think about these. So let's go back to that Shelter Cove property investment. Like, what the heck was I doing buying property when I was 18 years old? Well, the lots seemed really cheap. I was on my way down to Southern California for this surf trip with my buddy, and he had just bought a lot there. I went there. I was like, wow, this place is really cool. And part of the reason the lots were so cheap is because there wasn't a ton of demand. But I think in the 70s or 80s, this development had been approved, and they chopped up all these lots. Some of them were buildable, some of them not so much. And they made all these little tiny lots that weren't really worth a whole lot of money. And there was a ton of them, and there was a ton of them for sale at the same time. So I bought this lot for $13,000, and I think the people before me had paid a similar amount for it, like $10,000 to $13,000 for it too. And in retrospect, I think they were pretty stoked to sell it to me. But what got kind of crazy is I bought this, I think, in the summer of 2002 or 2003. I can't remember which. That was before a huge housing bubble started. And so within a couple of years, my lot had like shot up in value from like $13,000 to well over $50,000. I remember I was getting offers. I had just graduated nursing school, and I was getting offers for $50,000. And I was like, no way. I'm going to hold on to this thing forever. It's going to be worth a ton of money in the future. And even my brother, I saw my brother recently, and I mentioned I had gone there, and he was like, oh man, that must be worth a ton of money. And it's hilarious because it's not worth a ton of money. It's like I said, we show up, we have this weird experience there, and this lady's like, you got a shit lot. Nobody's going to buy that thing for you. Just hold on to it and pray. Maybe you'll get $10,000 for it. And it's kind of crazy. 23 years later, I'd be lucky if somebody gives me $10,000 for this lot and it's got an ocean view. But it comes back to supply and demand. And that's why with real estate, the saying is location, location, location. So in the lead up to that housing bubble, demand exploded. Like these little tiny properties in Shelter Cove, like a ton of them sold for insane amounts. Like my buddy bought his for $17,000, sold it for 90 something. And then the person who bought that, they lost it. It got repossessed by the banks, but it sold again a few years later after the bubble burst for like $10,000. So that's crazy, right? Somebody bought a piece of property for $90,000. My friend makes a big profit. And then the thing sells at like a fire sale price for $10,000 years later. But that's supply and demand. Seemingly a limited supply. There's like a ton of people all of a sudden. So I got it on the cheap because there was like a lot of lots available and nobody really wanted them. And then a few years later, all of a sudden, like everybody wants these lots and are willing to pay whatever, shoots the demand up. And then reality hits, the economy goes to crap, the bubble bursts, and now nobody wants to buy these lots. And there's like a ton of them again, and they're not worth anything. And so the prices crash again. And so what's interesting is like 10 years ago when I visited there, another kind of interesting thing about this place in Humboldt County, Northern California, a ton of people are growing weed, including Shelter Cove, where there was like tons of weed grow operations. And so the economy has actually collapsed there. And so what's happened? So a bunch of states have made weed legal. The price of weed has collapsed. There's no longer nearly as lucrative a market for weed. And so there's really not a great reason for people to live out in the middle of nowhere, out on the coast, even though it's a beautiful place. And I'll admit it was a little depressing when we visited. There was fewer people there. I read that like the population dropped by 50%, even though there's only like 800 something people there. It seemed like a lot less was going on there than the last time I had been there. It didn't seem like a thriving, vibrant community again. And that really sucks for me because, that means I'm not going to be selling that lot. And like my brother said, it must be worth a ton. It's like, no, it's not worth a ton. If it were in a high demand place, yeah, it would be worth a ton where people were moving to wanting to buy property. But no, people aren't moving there. And too many of those lots still haven't been built on. And there's plenty of houses that aren't terribly expensive that one could buy there too. But again, they would be buying in a low demand area with a high supply. So that's supply and demand in action. You would think buying a piece of property 23 years ago, it would be worth a lot more than when I paid for it. But it's not. And it comes down to basics of supply and demand. Don't assume real estate's always the smartest thing you can do. And that, I think, kind of ties in to part of the problem with housing, because I think there's this assumption like real estate's a no-brainer, and yeah, you got to get into it. It's like your ticket to the American dream and way to get ahead. And renting's stupid, so you gotta get into real estate as quickly as possible, no matter the cost. And this is clearly a sore spot for many. One thing we haven't discussed is interest rates. And so while I had said my parents back then, they seemed to buy multiple houses on the cheap. I mean, interest rates were way higher back then. So it's not like they were buying like $400,000 houses or the equivalent to that. Before I was born, the mortgage in the early 1980s, a mortgage rate could be as high as 18%. I mean, that's insane. And you think interest rates are high right now. Imagine 18%. So by the end of the 1980s, they had fallen to like around 10%. So how much would a mortgage payment at 18% cost on like the national median home price, like $400,000, if you didn't put any money down? Well, you'd be looking at $3,500 a month if you got that 10% interest rate, and over $6,000 a month at 18% interest. And that's not including taxes, fees, insurance, and whatnot. So obviously, nobody was paying $6,000 a month for a modest middle-class home in the 1980s. But I mean, those kinds of interest rates meant like you had to save up a higher down payment. I mean, the cost of ownership was way higher. You had to prepare more. It meant higher down payment, meant paying a lower price for the home because you can't pay too much for a home at 18%. It means you're going to borrow less, so you don't have to pay 18% interest. And then it means you're going to try to pay off that debt sooner or take a lower. You're not going to just be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to pay 18% indefinitely. I mean, you're going to be a little smarter with that interest rate, right? So also it means renting probably seemed like a much better deal, right? It's like, well, I can tie up a bunch of money and pay a ton of money in interest, or I can get a decent deal on rent. I mean, these days rent is higher and it certainly feels more expensive, especially depending on where you're living. But that's one idea that I think is pretty mainstream, is like this idea that renting is throwing your money away, which I totally disagree with. And that was one thing I'm thankful for when I came out of high school. I didn't see renting as throwing money away. I saw like buying your huge house and getting yourself locked into a job as throwing your money away, overpaying on a house, being stuck living there, and then having to work like 40 hours a week. I did not want to do that. I saw so many friends, parents doing that, and I was like, I don't want to do that. You got to have a place to live, and you can invest outside of rent. And that's kind of another podcast episode. But what I'm getting at is renting is not throwing money away. You need someplace to live, and not thinking about how much it costs you in interest, realtor fees, taxes, mortgage commissions, not building up any real equity in the home while potentially limiting your mobility. That doesn't provide freedom, the American dream, and I see that as potentially throwing money away, especially if you have no idea if doing all those things, buying a house, is actually more costly than renting, or if it actually costs you less than renting. So it's more complicated than just renting's for fools. You should buy a house as soon as possible. That's terrible advice. So renting is not throwing your money away. I rented for years before I decided to buy a home, and that enabled me to buy at the market bottom. So I also locked in potentially 30 years of a fixed ultra low housing cost, which gives me a huge advantage over other people right now. It lets me work way less. It lets me have more monthly cash flow. And, I compared the cost of renting versus buying, which is why I was like, oh yeah, we need to buy a house. This opportunity is good. Understanding supply and demand. And yeah, my wife and I wound up building a house like pretty much at the bottom of the Oregon housing market. It was great. It was a really smart decision. And, I made the sacrifices over the years to get good deals on rent too, like, trading landscaping hours for money off rent when I lived on Kauai. And then also our friends were moving out of this place and we knew they got a good deal on rent. It was going to be extended to us. And so my wife and I, they're like, oh yeah, we should close on our house in a month or something. And man, it didn't turn out that way. So my wife and I moved into this ridiculous converted garage, this tiny little studio, and we were really roughing it for what was supposed to just be a few weeks so we could move into this rental. We were roughing it on our family's property, paying them rent. And it wound up being 4 months. It was insane how lame it was to live in this tiny space with no kitchen and a funky bathroom. And I'm a tall guy and it's like had a low ceiling. So if I wasn't careful, I'd like slam my head into the ceiling when I got up from bed. But we wound up moving into this rental. Then we enjoyed really low rent, which let us save up even more money to buy a house at the bottom of the market a couple years later. So it worked out really well. And originally, when we moved back from Kauai, our plan was to travel. We in another podcast episode, I talk about how we traveled for several months, did a national park tour, and took off a ton of time during the Great Recession. But we had planned to move to the Bay Area, San Francisco, actually, and work as nurses there. But what I realized is I was like, God, we're going to have to pay like $2,000 to register our car there. We're going to have to pay more than $2,000 a month for like a studio apartment. Everything, it did not pencil out. It was like, this is going to cost a ton of money. We're going to pay a ton of money in taxes. We're going to tie up a ton of money in housing deposits. We're going to pay a ton of money in rent. It just didn't make sense. So we wound up just wait for this rental to become available and, live in Ashland, Oregon. Ashland, Oregon's a pretty nice place to live. It's a desirable place to live. It's nice. And we didn't wind up in the Bay Area. And we've actually been in Southern Oregon since 15 years later. So it was a good decision. It worked out really well. I'm not discounting the housing struggle. I get it. It's real. But, there's a lot of bad advice and rules of thumb. And homeownership's not right for everyone at any given time. And this abject despair over housing costs, I think it can get blown out of proportion. I compared my local rent to 20 years ago and adjusted it for inflation. And it is higher. It's outpaced inflation. But we're talking like a couple $100 more a month in an inflation-adjusted dollars, which is higher. But that's not like hopelessly higher. That's not like you're going to be broke and destitute for the rest of your life. You got to make some sacrifices and be smarter with your money. And that's really what this stuff comes down to and why you've got to really consider supply and demand, because New York City, San Francisco, they aren't the only places to live. But as a nurse, you've got to run the numbers because there's this relentless marketing machine and it's designed to get you into a house for whatever it takes, and buy tons of crap, because a lot of people make a lot of money when you buy a house. You got to furnish it. All these people are involved in the sale of it. Plenty of homeowners do well after they buy, but plenty don't. You got to run the numbers. And there's so much stuff people want to sell you, how we can be manipulated by supply and demand. So, artificial demand by marketing and manipulation. So when I was growing up, diamonds were thought of as a rare luxury investment. It turns out diamonds aren't that rare. And with lab-created diamonds, the market and prices of diamonds and the monopoly held by De Beers company, which is a mining company that had a monopoly on diamonds and price and could manipulate prices for decades, prices have really plummeted. And so De Beers apparently had a long history of buying up suppliers, limiting supply, creating artificial scarcity, so lowering the supply of diamonds. And that was coupled with this idea that diamonds are an ultra luxury, scarce, highly desirable item worth a lot of money, which was a hugely successful marketing campaign. So they did these two things. And so, diamonds weren't just forever. They're expensive too. But people these days, younger people, they don't care as much about having an exclusively natural mined diamond, which has a history of human rights issues anyways. They more care about getting a big old diamond that looks the same for a fraction of the price. Lab-created diamonds have impacted the supply and the demand and the price of a diamond. I remember when I chose my wife's engagement ring, this is like 2009, I chose it based on clarity, quality, and went with a smaller diamond to get a much nicer one. And it cost me an awful lot of money. And back then I preferred platinum to gold, so did my wife. And platinum was actually more expensive than gold back then. And that's not true now. Platinum's actually worth less and gold is more expensive again. What's funny is that same ring would probably cost a lot less today than it did back then. So, I mean, forget about getting yourself a 3-bedroom house. I mean, just buy tons of diamonds, show them off on social media. I'm joking. But this is a great example of how manipulation, marketing, and a competitor, increasing supply impacts demand and prices. And marketing these days is just completely out of control. And it is so sophisticated, from influencers to social media, and practically every interaction on the internet provides data that gives marketing and companies an edge. I mean, think about it. That's why are you seeing ads for stuff you were browsing or were thinking about? I mean, it's kind of weird, right? It's because advertisers have more information than you could possibly imagine. They follow you all over the internet and are constantly trying to manipulate and sell you something. I mean, that's just the reality we're living in these days. And so I'll be honest, I mean, I don't think the average consumer stands a chance against that. I mean, we're constantly being sold and pressured to demand all kinds of crap, whether we realize it or not. So it's pretty easy for demand to be really high, not necessarily because there's a natural demand for it, right? I think there's a lot more artificial demand. So caring less about what others think, aligning your money with your goals, will help you be less victim to these kind of marketing schemes. Our Nursing CE membership is designed to transform your approach to finances, help you really understand not that just this kind of economic concept, but your finances in general, a holistic approach, so that you're not just having dreams, but you're actually making smart decisions with your money to reach your goals and dreams. So you can work less, so you can live a better life, so you can invest, so you can be successful. And I mean, nurses work too hard to be losing their money, and our nursing courses are accredited, so you can get paid and reimbursed to take them. So check the links in the show notes. I want nurses to be successful and boost their financial well-being and get paid and reimbursed by their employers to do it. So we're pretty unique. Accredited education. But also, like I said, understanding supply and demand can help you make financial decisions too. So keep listening. Let's move on to tuition, right? Because the high price of tuition and the low value of the wages from an awful lot of degrees, I mean, it's kind of upending higher education. And there's still some issues in nursing. There's high demand. There's a shortage of nursing instructors. The nursing education has definitely gotten more expensive. It's still hard to get into. There's still more people wanting to become nurses than there are programs available. So that's all good. But that's not true of every other degree. I mean, some degrees have seen just a complete drop in demand for them. And it makes sense because they're like degrees that don't provide a return on investment. They're not worth it. And they don't help you get a good paying job from it. I mean, when I was in high school, I had no guidance from my teachers or high school counselors or anybody about considering a degree with a return on investment. I mean, the mantra was like, educated people make more money. So you just need to go to university, take out loans, spend whatever it takes to get a bachelor's degree or whatever. I mean, even in nursing, like nursing pitched was like pushing, hey, you got to get bachelor's degrees. And things have changed. LPNs are back in acute care in the hospital settings because of the nursing shortage. And like, as far as I can tell, a lot of employers don't really care as much about bachelor's degrees. They want nurses, and experienced nurses are even more ideal because they need them. But really, back then, it was my friend's dad who helped me realize I should become a nurse to enjoy not just a large return on the investment and income, but also to be able to help others. So, I mean, kind of cool. And so that's been my experience with nursing. It's given me a way to help people and earn a good income and live a good lifestyle and invest plenty of money. But I'm also always been kind of financially savvy, and I've definitely made financial mistakes, like I said, buying that Shelter Cove property. But I've always been inclined to invest and learn from mistakes and optimize. And that has really paid off big time, especially understanding supply and demand. I read my first book about economics, I think when I was 18. It was Economics in One Lesson, which was written in like 1946. It had some good lessons in it, and it talks about supply and demand. So I was thinking about these things from a somewhat young age. When I went to school, I hadn't really been thinking about the value of a degree. It just seemed like, oh yeah, you get your degree, you make money. And that's partly why I think so many millennials and younger generations are upset, is they're like, what the heck? Like, why am I paying all this money for a degree? And then I'm not seeing the return on the investment, especially with what my parents or like other generations before me did. But there are high-paying jobs. You just got to look at what's in demand, and you got to think about it. And that seems like common sense. But obviously, plenty of people haven't done that. With nurses, that's one advantage we have is our job, our skills and services are still in high demand, and we can still make a decent living from it, especially depending on where you live. And right now, it seems like anywhere in the country you can make pretty good money as a nurse, especially if you're willing to work as an agency or travel nurse. So again, we're seeing supply and demand in action. I'll just throw in here too, another barrier struggle for nurses is they tend to be really busy. It's easy to be really distracted these days. The nurses are not known for having high levels of financial literacy. I mean, plenty of nurses manage to do well with their money, but it's not like you got trained to do any of this stuff in nursing school. That whole idea with the diamonds, right, of basically people wising up, changing their behavior, and getting smart, and then rejecting overpaying for something. But on the flip side of that, as a nurse, like you made a really good decision becoming a nurse and going into a field with high income potential or higher middle class income potential. And there are ways that you can use that income, invest, and make much smarter decisions. But you got to address that financial literacy aspect, and you can't trust other people to just fix it for you. I mean, unfortunately, the onus is on ourselves to make smarter decisions with our money. And again, the Enriched Nurse has accredited nursing continuing education that you can get paid and reimbursed by your employer to take and get contact hours to address this financial literacy need for nurses. Make it easier, get actionable knowledge, and start doing much smarter things with your money and optimizing. If nothing else, be sure to subscribe. Check the show notes for the link. Get on my newsletter so I can get you more, at least free, actionable insights for improving your financial knowledge as a nurse and finding financial freedom. I mean, this isn't a popular opinion, but I see complaints about housing education as being like this ball and chain, making it impossible for young people to get ahead. And the internet is full of people complaining about how they got no prospects. But I hope I've provided some insights into how you can escape that mentality, because it really comes down to supply and demand. Even student loans. So I had around like $20,000 in student loans, and half of that was actually because I used a private student loan to pay off that Shelter Cove property I was telling you about, because it was kind of insane having like mortgage payment while I was going to nursing school. So a few $100 a month. So I got rid of that, used the student loan. And, these days, the average nurse student loan debt it's around $50,000. If you adjusted my loans for inflation, they'd be $32,000 today. So less, so $18,000 less. But I mean, $18,000, that's not an impossible ball and chain. It's not $200,000. It's $18,000. Yeah, I had a better deal. I had an advantage. It was less. But it would have taken me another 6 months beyond what I did to pay off the bulk of that. So, I mean, whoop-de-doo. I would not have been hopeless. I would have just been grumpier and remained frugal for a short time longer. When you make some sacrifices, when you understand supply and demand, when you understand the advantage you will get by reducing your expenses, and honestly, I would have taken out less student loans. There's things I did back then I didn't need to do that I was financing. So, I mean, there's a lot of other advantages these days, though, that weren't around for me back then, too. Like, I didn't get a sign-on bonus when I took my first nursing job. I didn't get a year-long residency. I wasn't able to go straight to days and go specialty. I had to grind it out on med-surg, a job I hated on night shift. It's not like it's all or nothing. Your perspective really is important. So if you want to build wealth and you want to gain a financial advantage, you should understand supply and demand. Reflect, look at the ways in your life, and use that to your advantage. If things are in really high demand, don't be willing to pay any price. Avoid things that are in high demand. Like when I buy a car, I don't look up what's the best car I can possibly get and what's the most popular best car I can get. No, I look up what is a car that has some of the best safety ratings, isn't quite as in high in demand, that I can get a pretty good deal on and still have all my needs met. And that's what I did when I bought my first SUV, saved thousands of dollars. The top SUV at the time was a Toyota Highlander. That was like the most popular one. That would have cost me like $20,000 more for the same year, very similar vehicle, same amount of miles. $20,000, that's a lot of money. I saved $20,000 by avoiding that thing that was in high demand. Have patience and be discerning, especially when it comes to housing and real estate. Renting is not throwing money away. I mean, the economy always moves in cycle. It sure feels like we're going through another economic cycle right now. A lot of people feel like we have been for quite some time. I mean, understanding these things can pay off big time with your personal wealth in big and small matters. It helps for investing. It helps when you're making major purchases. It helps when you're making minor purchases. And it certainly has paid off for this millennial nurse. So thank you so much for listening today. I hope you got some good insights. Don't neglect supply and demand, and consider how supply and demand is impacting the things in your life, the things in the economy, and look at ways that you can gain an advantage, leveraging your nursing income and ability to make better financial decisions. All right, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and hope to see you in one of my courses.